I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar,
5 more hours, we can start
and the decline and
Let's do a little rule.
rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish,
How was Germany never a great empire? I feel very
French,
offended.
Indian,
Maybe you should play some Hitler in
Japanese,
Hoi 4.
Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring?
Honestly, you guys in a conversation of empires, I think the USA, after World War II, is the greatest empire of all times. Look at the clothing you wear. Look at your phone, right? Everything is actually made in China. Dum, dum, dum!
An empire's power. In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade,
I'm building my own microchips.
military
Really cool. I like
strength,
it.
the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining.
After China becomes the big boss.
By examining the sequences from many countries,
right? Who will be next?
we can see how a typical cycle transpires.
Maybe Nigeria?
And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity.
Crazy how much impact on history Hitler had, huh? And the Nazis. How impactful that was. Even though you could argue it would have happened anyway, right? Let me just apply it in your artillery piece that I will never use because there's never any war.
It typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. It can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power
Doesn't this video
gets
kind of want to make you like play EU4?
strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new
It's kind of
winners
scary, right? We're kind of in that phase now, and China-USA war should happen.
and losers. Then the winners get
That makes
together
sense.
to create the new world order. And the cycle begins again.
He's kind of saying USA and China will fight soon.
She slipped through my fingers like sand. Heard that she had a man. Now I'm just sitting here sad. Oh well, ship sail. She slipped through my fingers like sand.